Good day, everybody. It's Chris Gallagher here at the Preacher's Pen. I want to thank you for tuning in to our Bible classes that we've been going through this year. Currently, for this week, we're on Psalm 51. And yesterday, we gave you the background of Psalm 51, and I would encourage you to go back and at least examine a little bit of what David has done in his life that has led him to Psalm 51. In Psalm 51, David is pouring his heart out to God. And if you remember, we went back and we looked at the story in Samuel of how David had sinned with Bathsheba. Nathan encounters David. He tells David a parable. David gets angry. David wants to kill the man in the parable. And Nathan says, "It's you." So then what David does, and we look at this psalm as to David's reaction, because David sits down and David writes this psalm. And I want you to notice a couple of these verses. Now, yesterday we read through it, so we're not going to do that again today. But the first thing that David asks is for God to have mercy upon him. And that's where we're going to dig into, because David, all throughout this, pleads for God's mercy. So as we get into this, I want to encourage you, if you haven't already, go over and check out thepreacherspen.org, sign up for our newsletter list, and also sign up for our prayer request. If you've got one you want to share with us, I'd be glad to pray for you, to put you with our team of individuals that we have that are praying for folks daily, and we would love to have you as a part of that. But let's dig into the text a little bit this morning. Psalm 51, beginning in verse 1. David says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, and blot out my transgressions." As David pleads with God, knowing that he sinned, knowing that he has taken the life of Uriah the Hittite, and he's taken that life by his choice. And he's created a scandal even in his own kingdom by his choice. So he appeals to God, and he asks God to have mercy upon him. Now, the original word for mercy, and I am not a Hebrew scholar, but the original word for mercy that we have here in Psalm 51 and verse 1 has to do with kindness that's being offered to an inferior. At this point in David's life, David realizes what he's done. He's realized his problem. He's realized that really that he's gone against God that created everything that we see, that he created the heavens and the earth, and here David is begging for God to forgive him. But he pleads for God's kindness on an inferior, because David knows that he's not there with God. And he does this based upon God's steadfast love. David knows of the love of God. In fact, we'll talk a little bit later about the verse in the New Testament that says that David is a man after God's own heart. But notice what he says, "Have mercy on me according to your love, and according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions." Transgressions is a rebellion against God. It's where you transgress or you step over what you already know. Sometimes we did this as children, right? I'm sure we don't do it as adults, but we probably did this as children. Our parents would say, "Don't do that," or "Don't go there," or "If you touch that one more time," and what sometimes would we do as children? Well, sometimes we would touch it one more time. We would cross the line. There was a definite line that was there that we crossed, and we did it because of our rebellious nature. And that's what David is saying. Blot out my transgressions. Take care, erase, have them gone away. But do this according to your mercy, knowing that David knows that God is superior to him. He's superior to him in kindness. He's superior to him in his steadfast love. David is begging God to take care of his rebelliousness, of take care of his rebellion against God. And further, notice what he says in verse 2. He says, "Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." Iniquities are what we would consider to be the offense of God's law. So not only is it a rebellious nature, but it's knowing the law and going against it. When we think of rebellion, we think of somebody who just kind of spurs up and says, I'm just done and I'm going to move on. And David did that with the sin with Bathsheba. If you take all the steps that David did, you'll start to realize that David was just simply being rebellious. He was going against God's law, but of a rebellious nature. Not just going against it as immaturity, but really going against it because it's what David wanted. But then he says this, "And cleanse me from my sins." Sin is missing the mark. It's not achieving what you really want to achieve. So David asked God to take away his rebellion, Okay, to take away his offenses and to take away his sin of him missing the mark. And notice what David says, verse 3. David does something that everybody needs to do. David accepts responsibility. Now, David, I'll go ahead and say it. We all know it. David has shunned responsibility because he didn't think about it. He killed Uriah the Hittite. He thinks everything's okay. Bathsheba's still pregnant. Everything's going to be fine. But what we end up finding out is David now has to accept responsibility. And we question this. We say, why would David, the king, how would everybody not know this? Well, I imagine that there's probably many who did. In fact, those who are guards at the kingdom, when Uriah would not go in would not go home. Instead, he stayed and he was on the steps of the palace because he wanted to be out fighting. He knew where he was supposed to be. So there were people who knew about this, but David has to own up. He has to accept responsibility. And Nathan's parable to David shakes up David. It makes him accept responsibility. And if you go back and look at the text again, and we'll look at this several different times in 2 Samuel 17, as you see that David, he bears it before God, and he asks God that, God, will you forgive me? And that's what David is asking God here in this psalm. He is begging God to forgive him. He wants God to forgive him. In fact, I think I said 2 Samuel 17 before, but it's 2 Samuel chapter 12. As David says this, he ends up hearing from Nathan that he is the man. And David says in verse 13 of 2 Samuel 12, David says, I've sinned against the Lord. And Nathan even says to David, the Lord has put away your sin and you shall not die. But we find in this passage that David is still begging God to take this away. But in verse 3, David takes responsibility. Notice what he says, for I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me. This language that David uses shows that he's taking responsibility for his rebelliousness, and he's also understanding that his sin is ever before him. Many times when we read this passage, we think of 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2, where some people have their conscience seared as with a hot iron. But many people have a conscience that convicts them. David understands to have this sin that's before him. David is going to have a memory of this. David is going to have an understanding as to what's happening. So David bears this responsibility. Then in verse 4 he continues, says, against you and you only have I sinned and done what's evil in your sight. Now, David, he admits his sin, but he's now focused on the judgment of God. He knows what's coming. And David's not shedding the responsibility against Bathsheba and Uriah. I do not believe that he is. In fact, David is accepting all of this responsibility because all of our sins are ultimately against God. Everything that we do, time that we miss the mark, we miss this perfection, we go against God's law and our iniquities and our rebelliousness and our transgression, we are going against God's law. And that's what David is saying, against you and you only have a sin, and I have done what is evil in your sight, so you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. David's not saying I did this so you can judge me. David's saying I understand your judgment, and I know that your judgment is perfectly clear against me. David is not making any excuses. And verse 5 is not an excuse either, where he says, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. David is not saying, hey, because this happened in the past, look where I am now. David is not saying, and by the way, he's not saying I was born in sin. There was a situation apparently with his family that caused something to happen, because we know Ezekiel 18 and verse 20, the soul that sins shall die. That's why Jesus said in Mark chapter 16, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. If you don't believe, you have to have the ability to believe in that. That's why children are innocent. They're safe. And David's not making any excuses, but he tells God, really, as he pleads to him in verse 6, behold, you delight in truth and in the inward being. You teach me wisdom in the secret heart. David is begging God to hear him, to blot this out, because David knows the nature of God, and he's returning to him. My question to you is this: as we think about our rebellion, our offenses towards God, and our missing the mark, have we accepted responsibility? Have we in our life, have we thought about the responsibility that we have as individuals looking forward to God's forgiveness, but really being able to accept and say, God, that was us, and we need your mercy. We need your abundant mercy from your steadfast love. I hope that you'll consider that today as we've covered just a little bit of Psalm 51, giving you a lot to think about. But thanks for being here today on our second day of our study in Psalm 51. Check back tomorrow, and we'll get into day number 3. We'll pick up at verse 7, and we'll continually move forward. But as always, check us out, preacherspen.org. And always, once again, we always have to say it, we hope that you have a blessed day. We look forward to talking to you soon. Be blessed.